We begin with our first film of the semester and one of the most popular films in cinematic history, Gone with the Wind. As we watch, think of the movie in terms we discussed in the course introduction. As a secondary source, is Gone with the Wind giving us reliable history of the Civil War? And as a primary source, how does it reflect the social and cultural atmosphere of 1939 America? Let's first take a look at how the movie came into being. The movie was based on the 1936 novel by Margaret Mitchell. Mitchell was a native Atlantan with deep Southern roots. A journalist by trade, she wrote the book in her spare time for a decade, and by 1935 the novel was several thousand pages jammed in a suitcase under her bed. She didn't originally intend to even publish it, but Mitchell impulsively gave the suitcase to a New York City literary agent that she had met through a mutual friend. By the time she called to tell him to disregard the book, the agent had already begun reading it and believed it had the potential to be a massive hit, which it was. By the end of 1936, the novel had won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, it had become an international sensation, and was on its way to becoming a major motion picture. Producer David O. Selznick bought the movie rights and had the gargantuan task of shaping the sweeping novel into a Technicolor movie. His first concern was casting. He chose Clark Gable as Rhett Butler to wide public acclaim, but the starring role was trickier. Scarlett O'Hara had to be beautiful and resourceful, but also spoiled and shallow. She wasn't always likable, but audiences needed to root for her. Filming was already underway when Selznick had found his Scarlett, a relatively unknown, classically trained British actress named Vivien Leigh. The film was completed in the fall of 1939 and premiered in Atlanta. The city scheduled 3 days of festivities, culminating in a screening of the film with the starring cast in attendance, except the black cast members, because it was Georgia in 1939 and Jim Crow reigned supreme. Black audiences were legally barred from white-only designated public places, including movie theaters. So Hattie McDaniel, who played the pivotal role of Mammy and won the first Academy Award given to an African-American actor, wasn't permitted to attend the premiere of her own film. The role itself was tangled in the race politics of the era, too. McDaniel had received criticism from black activists for playing such a stereotypical happy slave character. She responded to her critics with the barb, "I'd rather be paid good money to play a maid than be paid very little to be one." Another thing to keep in mind with Gone with the Wind as a primary source of 1939 is the fact that the movie was released at a time when the United States had experienced the worst economic disaster in American history. The Great Depression resulted in millions of Americans losing their life savings due to bank failures, and unemployment skyrocketed to 25%, in some urban areas as high as 33%. The themes of loss and rebuilding experienced by Scarlett O'Hara and her family may have resonated among audiences who had experienced similar losses during the 1930s. Now we can talk about the film as a secondary source of the 1860s. If you took Gone with the Wind as a documentary of the 1860s social structure, you might get the impression that slavery was a fairly genial arrangement. Plantations looked like idyllic places run by cheerful slaves who were treated more or less like family by their owners. In reality, slavery was a brutal institution. The average life expectancy for an American slave at birth was in the low 20s. Infant and child mortality rates were twice as high among slave children as among Southern white children. The movie begins literally at the start of the war in April of 1861. In the film, the war is portrayed as an act of unprovoked aggression against the South, which merely went to war to defend its rights. But the Civil War was rooted in a complex series of decade-long debates about the creation of new states, political compromises about states' rights, and the congressional balance of power, along with the driving moral imperative to end slavery. The Yankees are the clear villains in Gone with the Wind, particularly over the burning of Atlanta. And Atlanta was burned. In 1864, the Union General William Tecumseh Sherman launched a weeks-long siege against the city. The city was invaded and razed by Sherman's troops. Immediately after the sack of Atlanta, Sherman divided his troops into two columns and marched them westward to Savannah, cutting a 60-mile-wide swath of destruction in their wake. The troops confiscated whatever foodstuffs they needed to survive while burning crops and slaughtering livestock along the way. Sherman's plan was designed to crush the morale of the Southern citizens, which it did.
Take a good look, my dear. It's a historic moment. You can tell your grandchildren how you watched the old South disappear one night.
From one perspective, this was an effective military strategy to end a long, drawn-out war of attrition, with heavy losses on both sides. For the Confederates, Sherman's march became emblematic of the villainy and cruelty of Union occupation. When the war was over, the South had to be literally and figuratively rebuilt. This has become known as the Reconstruction era, the backdrop for the second half of the film. Pay attention to the scene in which Scarlett O'Hara is attacked while riding her buggy through a shantytown outside of Atlanta. In retaliation, the menfolk form a vigilante posse to seek revenge on her attackers. In the film, this vigilante group is referred to as a political meeting. In the novel, these men explicitly belong to the Ku Klux Klan. The KKK was formed at the end of the Civil War by Confederate veterans, and its purpose was to reinstate the old social hierarchy of wealthy whites at the top, poor whites at the middle, and blacks at the bottom. The Klan used physical violence and intimidation to keep newly freed slaves from voting and from attaining any form of social or political equality. By leaving the Klan unnamed, Selznick was hoping to avoid racial tensions and criticisms. So, happy slaves, Confederate sympathies, and Technicolor drama. Is Gone with the Wind a valid secondary source despite its flaws? And as a primary source, what does it tell us about the sensibilities and tastes of 1939 moviegoers? What other themes and subtexts can we find if we dig deeper?